The problem of pornography. And the subtitle that UCI have chosen is that it is something which is wreaking havoc among Christians. I don't know if that can be an understatement, but if it can be, it probably is. It's probably affecting a lot more people than we realize. It's probably affecting a lot more people in this audience than we realize. And so I think the talking about it and the thinking about it, especially as it relates to some things that God would want us to think about, I think is an important conversation for us to have. And so even though it is what I think is a very sensitive subject, the nature of it's sensitive, and to talk about it in an audience that is as diverse in age as this may even be more sensitive. And so I am aware of that. But nonetheless, I think we need to talk about it because those it affects are becoming younger and younger, and they're becoming more and more. And so I think it's important for us to discuss that and for me to talk about that to the best of my ability in a way that would understand the sensitivity of the subject. So I ask you to bear with me. I don't believe there will be anything in this presentation that would offend. That it certainly would never be my intent. Everything I want to say and show has strictly to do with trying to help us as we all either directly or indirectly face this difficulty. And so I want us to talk about that tonight. I want us to think about the solutions to these problems as we can. I will tell you, and I think it's important for you to understand this. Since I've been here, there have been people who are part of this group who have come to me to talk about this issue. More than one, and more than two, and less than 100. Let me just leave it at that. But let me tell you, it's a real problem. And it's a problem that we need to address. And so I want to do that, at least tonight, to a degree that maybe will help us and will promote our interest in trying to resolve this issue in our own lives. Is pornography a problem? These statistics are 4 years old. $60 billion industry worldwide. Most money made from online sales, as probably most of us would expect, as in most sales now are made online. 90% of kids 8 to 16 have viewed pornography. That ought to shock us in some ways. Average age of first view is 11. I know these are sensitive statements to make, and there is a sense in which I wish I didn't have to make these, but I want you to be aware of what we're up against. The number one consumer of porn is 12 to 17-year-old boys. Not exclusively, you understand, but the number one consumer. That ought to tell us what we're up against. And there are many more statistics that I think can be easily documented, but I think these suffice it to help us understand the nature of the problem and the difficulty as we are trying to live godly lives, the difficulties that all of us face. It is not a problem that is exclusive to men. It is primarily a man's issue, but it is not exclusively a man's issue. So I'm talking to all of us tonight as we think about this. How do we define pornography? Let me just read this. Our problem is that when we think of something pornographic, we just think of hardcore movies. But that's limiting the definition. The American Heritage Dictionary defines porn as sexually explicit pictures, writing, or other material whose primary purpose is to cause sexual arousal. Therefore, porn includes mainstream movies with nudity and/or sex scenes, explicit photos, pictures in soft men's magazines, Sports Illustrated swimsuit issues, and even some women's magazines. It includes romance novels that create porn in one's mind, music videos, and even just the words of songs that offer word pictures. Lust, as Jesus described it in Matthew 5:28, that we're, I think, somewhat familiar with, is creating a porn film in one's mind. We have become desensitized because of how widespread it is. This is pretty explicit language here, specific. And I think it helps us understand that we're not just talking about, as that first sentence says, we're not just talking about hardcore movies. We are talking about things that affect all of us in various ways. What does pornography create? Studies in the past 50 years have revealed that porn alters the neural pathways of the brain. Over time, these neural pathways become like ruts and canyons that the brain automatically falls in when pleasure is desired. The website Covenant Eyes, which provides blocking software, says this: pornography taps into the neurocircuitry of our brains, signaling the release of dopamine, serotonin, opiates, oxytocin, and other hormones and neurotransmitters. This hormonal cocktail is part of our body's natural response to sexual activity. But when combined with graphic porn, the brain experiences a sexual high at unnatural levels. Those who have developed an addictive relationship to pornography experience an overwhelming craving that seems uncontrollable. I am not a doctor, nor am I an expert in understanding this. Information is taken from those who I would assume and could assume are experts. So that tells us specifically what we're talking about. The last sentence: those who have developed an addictive relationship to pornography experience an overwhelming craving that seems uncontrollable. When I talk to people about this issue, that in a nutshell, folks, is what people tell me. Men specifically, men exclusively to this point. That those who have experience, referring to themselves, have developed an addictive relationship to pornography, and that experience has caused them to have this overwhelming craving. And this craving, they typically would say, seems uncontrollable. Well, for someone to say that what they're doing and what they're involved in that is sinful is uncontrollable and it is addictive and there is an overwhelming craving ought to tell us we got a problem, folks. It may not just be we have a problem collectively. We don't have this problem collectively. You have this problem individually. And my guess is that there are several in this audience who have this problem. Because it is an addictive thing. It is a craving and it is uncontrollable, which is really what the studies are telling us. I have a friend who is a young preacher. You may know him. You probably don't know him well. That's irrelevant to my point. He has a sermon that he often preaches called How to Catch a Monkey. And the point of the sermon is the way you catch a monkey is you get a cage or you get a box and you put a hole in that box big enough, large enough for the monkey to reach his hand in. I guess monkeys have paws, whatever you have. I don't know what a monkey has. But when they reach in and you put a bait inside the box or the cage, and when they grip that fist or hand broadens. It gets wider. And so they grasp at it and try to pull out. When they pull it out, they can't because they're holding on to something. And the point to that is that the only way they're going to get their paw or their hand out is to let go. Then they can pull it out. But they don't. Because what they have their hands around or what they are holding is so powerful to them that they would rather get caught than let go of what they have. That's how addictive any addiction is, whether it's pornography, whether it's drugs, whether it's food, whether it's some addiction that may be good. We can be addicted to good things. But that's how addictions work. Now, again, let me reiterate, I'm not an expert about addictions, and I'm not standing before you tonight to say, if you're addicted, this is how you solve that issue. But I do think we can talk about some things that will help us. And let me go ahead and say that there may be some who need to get professional help to resolve this issue. That's certainly something that can be discussed. But the question is how to stop. Now, there are a lot of people who say, I'll tell you how to stop doing something that's sinful. You stop it. It's like that old Bob Newhart sketch. A woman came to him talking about some issues that she had, and he said, now when you leave this office, I want you to remember 2 words. Stop it. And that's what I want you to do. Well, that's pretty good advice. But I'll tell you what, folks, sometimes just saying stop doing what it is that you're doing is not good enough. Most often that doesn't work, because in addictions, what I have learned is that the brain's capacity to work has already been compromised. And once that happens, then to simply say you need to stop that may not suffice to actually stop what is going on. And there may be multiple ways to stop this. Again, I'm not an expert. I just know what I read. I know what I hear. I know what people say to me. But I want us to think about something tonight, specifically as it relates to the danger that sexual images have on our eyes. And what that happens, you know, Job 31:1 says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? And we preachers, when we're talking about anything that relates to this kind of thing, we typically mention this. And I think we mention it because it is a powerful statement by Job about how he resolved in his own mind that he would make a covenant with his eyes. In essence, not to gaze, not to look upon as he says here, not to look upon a virgin, but not to look upon anyone with whom he might have the wrong kind of ideas and the wrong kind of feelings. So let's think about some good practical reasons to avoid sexual images and why we ought to do that. Well, first of all, I would say because it is wrong. And for me to stand before you and say, then you just need to stop that, I think is essential. I think that's a good thing to say. We just need to stop it. If we're doing anything that has a sinful practice, we need to stop that. And I think that the only people who will stop that are the people who feel strongly enough about it to say, I'm not going to do something and sin against God. It's what I call the Joseph syndrome. And I think that's what Joseph had. He had the willingness to say, I'm not going to do that. And we need to have the willingness to say that as well. But I think it may go a little bit further than that. That's not always easy, as I have indicated. So, what are some other concerns? Well, viewing porn is not a victimless activity. We may look at that, or we may think about looking at that and say, well, it's only affecting me. And the answer to that question is that's not the case. Interviewers of ex-performers reveal that most in the industry were abused or abandoned as children. We're talking about those who are actively participants in what is viewed. Abused children feel betrayed and unloved, leaving emptiness in their souls. This emptiness drives them to seek intimacy and love in sexual ways instead of godly ways. The sad part is that the industry continues their abuse. Most take drugs to numb the pain. So consider, even when a person clicks on a free site, every click sends money to the industry through advertisers. The person who clicks is participating in the abuse. No one's victimless. We may think it may be affecting just me, and the answer to that question is that's not true. It's affecting others as well. And while that may not be the most moving of reasons why we need not look at these kind of images, it certainly is a factor. Or this, viewing sexual images chemically rewires the brain. We talked a little bit about that in this chart that we talked about, but I think we need to understand that it rewires. And the essence of that, it seems to me, is simply saying that rewiring the brain creates this addiction, and once it's wired a specific way, it is extremely difficult to change it, to move it in the right direction, to move it in the direction that God wants it to go. So we need to understand that doing this rewires what's happening in our heads, in our minds, in our brains. And again, that may not be the most moving of reasons not to, but it is a factor, and we need to be aware of that. Also, viewing porn is joining one's mind to a prostitute. We may not see it that way. We may not think of it that way. And Paul explains that a person, however, becomes one flesh with her. That passage in 1 Corinthians 6, we're going to look at it in just a minute. But joining with her is more than just a physical or a biological incident. There are strong mental connections with being made, and it's a violation of oneness with the Lord. You reverse that and take it out of the negative and put it a positive. That's the way it is with two people who are married, who are rightfully married, who participate in this kind of activity. There are strong mental connections that are made. And even if a person didn't have a wife, this is still adultery against the Lord. It's a unique sin against one's own body and uses one's body in a way that does not glorify God. Listen to what Paul said. All things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Food's for the stomach, and the stomach for foods. But God will destroy both it and them. Now the body's not for sexual immorality, but for the Lord. And the Lord for the body. Now if we just stop right there, that ought to answer all these questions. That says it in a nutshell. But he goes on further to talk about this. And God both raised up the Lord and will also raise us up by His power. Do you not know that your bodies are members of Christ? Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a harlot? Certainly not. Or do you not know that he who is joined to a harlot is one body with her? For the two, he says, shall become one flesh, referring to what God had originally said. But he who is joined to the Lord is one spirit with Him. So flee sexual immorality. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God? And you are not your own, for you were bought at a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. And let me tell you something. The only kind of person that's going to appreciate that and follow that is a spiritually minded person. That's it. And if what motivates and drives you is this desire to look at or satisfy certain physical, sexual urges that a person might have, if that's what drives you, this is not going to help you. It should, but it won't. And that's part of the problem. Those who profess faith and who say, no, God, I understand who God is, we have to understand that our body is for the Lord. Now, there may be senses about that we don't fully understand, but I think in principle we understand what Paul is trying to say here. So for a person to engage in the kind of activity that we're talking about that he or she shouldn't engage in tonight, for a person to do that, they just have to disavow the fact that the Holy Spirit is within them and their body is to do with what they want to do. They just have to disavow that altogether. And of course, most people do. And so they're driven to act in whatever ways they choose to act. And so they get themselves in the kind of difficulties that we're talking about. Well, what else? Porn addiction sends a person into a fantasy world that's preferred over real people. Think about this. Addicts admit that they would rather view porn than have an intimate relationship with their own spouse or any other person. Now that's tragic there. Studies have shown that viewers can no longer look at a woman in a pure light. Whew. She or he is immediately evaluated and placed in one of the movies of his or her brain. Paul said, to the pure, all things are pure. To the defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their minds and their consciences are defiled. Years ago, this has been probably 25 years ago, a friend of mine, who through the years I had become less acquainted with, came to me one day and said to me that it was difficult for him to look at any woman and not have impure thoughts. Driving down the road, going to the mall, going shopping, going to a restaurant. He said, it's become very difficult for me to look at any woman and not have these kind of thoughts. This was a conversation he and I had after he and his wife had divorced for his unfaithfulness multiple times. Need to keep in mind what Paul said to Titus. Think carefully about that. Viewing sexual images is voyeurism. Would you peek through your neighbor's window if your neighbor gave you permission? If your neighbor said, I don't care if you want to see what's going on in my house, in my bedroom, you're welcome to do that. If they gave you permission, would you do that? No, that's sinful. Viewing others in sexual acts is equivalent to uncovering the nakedness of a person. God has forbidden our eyes to see it. They're saying it's okay for you to view me. It's not God saying it's okay for you to view me. I don't think any of us have a difficulty in understanding that. That's an abomination to Him. To view that nakedness, that's an abomination to God. So we understand that that's not something that God is pleased with. We wouldn't do that. But yet, in essence, that's what pornography is. Viewing sexual images is today's idolatry. What's happening today is typical of what had happened in the first century. Romans 1 shows that when God is no longer worshipped, something else is to be worshipped. And of course, what that tells us is they worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. And if you're going to do that, then everything's wide open. If you're not going to serve the creature, or rather the Creator, and serve the creature, then whatever the creature wants, which is us, you have a right to do. Pornography is a worship of the human body, which is exactly the reason that it leads to dishonorable passions and unnatural relations. There's not a thing in the world wrong inherently with a human body that's unclothed. Not one thing. It's God-given. But all of that has to be dealt with in the right kind of environment. Bodies are unclothed in certain environments where it is perfectly sound and right because of what is happening. And then sometimes bodies are unclothed in certain environments where it is all wrong and leading to difficult things. And we're not people who can't reason those things out. But we need to make sure that we haven't turned ourselves into people who worship the creature as opposed to the Creator. And that's really what pornography is. I'm not going to take the time to read this passage because I think you're very familiar with that passage. Porn seriously damages the relationship with one's spouse or future spouse. We would understand that. And I think all of us, who, whether we're married or whether we're not married, we need to understand that this is something that will happen. If you're married and involved in that, there is no doubt that it will damage that relationship. If you're not married yet, and if you plan to be or think you may later on to be involved in that kind of activity now, will damage that relationship. And you need to make sure that you understand that that's a consequence that you will face if you're involved in that kind of behavior. 7 things for us to think about that relate to how not viewing the image, why that's important to not do that. And that can be in various capacities, folks. It doesn't have to be in hardcore pornographic movies. It can be in all these kind of things where we see these images. It can be on our television screens. It can be at our movie houses. It can be in books that we read. It can be in sites that we see. It can be in music that we listen to. It can be in a variety of things. So we need to be very careful about that. And think about this principle stated in Isaiah 55:2. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me and eat what is good, and let your soul delight itself in abundance. That's what God said through Isaiah. That's what we need to make sure we're doing. That's a principle I think that if we follow, we will go a long way toward helping ourselves to solve any kind of addictions or really any kind of problems that we may have. So let me think about something practically with you now. So how do we overcome this? This particular picture, that's a pretty common sight probably among a lot of people who have an interest in solving the problem. Here is a relatively young man, apparently looking like he's somewhat maybe in a hotel room with his smartphone, possibly praying or thinking about the damage that he's caused not only to himself but to his God and to others. And at least to me, when I look at that, I see at least someone who wants to say, what is it that I need to do? How is it that I can overcome? And I want to say again, I don't know all the answers to this. But let me offer one verse that I think can help us. And I want you to think with me about this, if you would. This is 2 Timothy 2, verse 22, where Paul would tell this young evangelist, you need to flee also youthful lust. And you need to pursue righteousness and faith and love and peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. I am always aware that in the letters of Paul to Timothy and Titus, in those 3 letters, the fleeing of youthful lust and the avoidance of those kinds of things is pretty prevalent. He states that quite often. And he tells these men to be aware of that. Not only to be aware of it themselves, but to be aware of it for the sake of others and to talk about it, and to preach about it, and to instruct people about it. And so he says here to Timothy, you need to flee youthful lust. And I think there are 3 things that I want to call to your mind when we think about this that would be good for us to remember when we're facing these. We need to run from youthful lust. We need to run from youthful lust. You know, how can I practically make that clear? Well, let me suggest this. We need to run from what I call physical triggers. There are certain things that trigger certain thoughts in a man's mind. There are certain things that will trigger certain thoughts in your mind, both men and women. And so we need to flee those physical triggers. And I think we need to flee these visual triggers, these images that are designed most often for the very purpose of triggering some feeling or some idea or some thought in either a man or a woman's mind about something that they have no right to engage in. So avoid those visual triggers. And then avoid those mental triggers. Avoid those thoughts. When Jesus said, when a man looks upon a woman to lust after her, Matthew 5, he commits adultery in his heart. We get that, don't we, men? We get that, don't we? And that may be difficult for some. And so what we have to do is we have to avoid those lustful fantasies, which is what they really are. These mental triggers that say something about us wanting something that we have no right to. So we got to run from that kind of stuff. Got to run from it. And then we have to run to righteousness and faith and love and peace, all these things that the Lord told Paul to remind Timothy of. You need to flee this. And it seems to me like this is an interesting connection. Doesn't it seem that way to you? He says, flee youthful lust. Instead, pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. He's got those 2 things contrasted there, doesn't he, for a young man? Doesn't he have that? Doesn't that show us how powerful youthful lust are? Because the way you flee from that is you pursue all these other things, these high and mighty and holy spiritual things like righteousness, faith, and love and peace. Do that instead of pursuing youthful lust. That's a powerful statement to me. And as hard as this may be for a young or an older man to do, that's what he says you need to run to that. You need to run from this and you need to run to this. And then what I think is a very interesting comment that he makes in this last part of this verse, he says, you need to run with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. You need to find folks that are going to help you. I know that there are people, even among us, who are involved with other people in terms of trying to get help. And that's good. That's right. That's the way it ought to be. Accountability partners, to some degree we might call them. But they are trying to associate and run with those who do call on the Lord, who are believers, who are trying to pursue this pure heart that Paul talks about here. And I think that's important. The thing that Lee prayed about tonight in his prayer, he made a statement. I don't remember the exact verbiage of it, but the statement was about how we do need each other. And that is so critical, folks. As men, we need each other to help us be accountable for the very kinds of things that we're talking about. And then, let me just finally say, and I think this picture says it, but just think about the fact that we need to pray to God. I do believe that prayer helps. I'm confident that you believe prayer helps as well. We need to ask God to help us to avoid these kind of things. Is this the total solution to the problem? No. I didn't preach the lesson because I thought this answered all the questions. But I preached the lesson to make us aware, to maybe help us if we're involved in this kind of activity, to try to get help. And to understand that avoiding these kind of things are things that God wants, and we need to do our very best to solve that. It is a problem, folks, that's just run rampant. And both individuals are trying to deal with it there's a lot of good material out there to help with this kind of thing. Churches are bringing people in to try to help with this sort of thing. That may be something we need to consider ourselves. Men who can help us think about the problems from a biblical perspective and help us try to deal with these kind of things. But I hope that the lesson tonight has been helpful to you and that you would consider these kind of things. And if you're involved in this kind of activity, folks, please let us help, because we certainly want to honor God with our lives in every way that we can. I appreciate, as always, your kind attention. If you have a spiritual need tonight that we can help you with, please let us know that by coming forward as we stand and sing.